well known to me and many in the room. Deirdre Hyland is a director of clinical research, nurse education in the RCSI CRC and an active research nurse in that CRC. And she is going to take us back close to the beginning and talk to us about trial setup. Deirdre.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Pat, and I'd like to thank the Trial Methodology Research Network for asking me to speak today. So I was asked to talk to you about study setup with a particular emphasis on service record staff delegation and training, and this is in relation to investigator responsibilities. So I'm going to talk about training first, so staff recruitment and training, and then the use of delegation logs, and then move on to service records. And I'll be incorporating the quality management issues into the talk, and also talking a little bit about the HPRA inspections, expectations and inspections. So Deirdre has paved the way for me in that regard. So first of all, I wanted to see what does GCP actually say about these areas. So it says that the investigators should be qualified by education, training and experience, and that's to assume responsibility for the safe and proper conduct of a clinical trial. But also, and that would be evidenced in things like, you know, the medical licence of the investigator, the curriculum vitae showing their research experience, prior successful research and how they've worked with sponsors in the past and so on. But then also each individual involved in conducting the trial should also be qualified by education, training and experience, and that's to perform the particular tasks that are delegated to them. And the World Health Organization Handbook for Good Clinical Research Practice says that they also should be currently licensed to do so. So for example, if you're engaging the services of a research nurse, they need to be on the live register of on-board alternates, the Nursing and Midwifery Board of Ireland. It doesn't, it's not enough that they've just done that kind of thing in the past. They're still a nurse and they're still expected to be licensed. So in relation to adequate resources, the investigator needs to have access to the adequate number of qualified staff and adequate facilities for the foreseen duration of the trial. They need to maintain a list of appropriately qualified and trained persons for the tasks they're allocating. So that's where we'll get into delegation logs. And also they're responsible for ensuring that all persons assisting with the trial are fully informed about the protocol, about the procedures they're going to do, about the IMP and their trial related duties and functions. And it's very important to note that that's an investigator responsibility. Usually the sponsor for commercial trials will provide some training at investigator meetings and at site initiation meetings, but not all staff members will attend those, and the training does have to be passed on to everybody who has a trial related task. But also then, as Deirdre said, if staffing change, so a team changes over in July, all the new people coming in have to be appropriately trained. And that's, I suppose, it is an increasing thing that the sponsor is less likely now to come in and train new staff. It's often a site responsibility. So in relation to training and delegation, these are the areas that you need to be aware of as investigators and as members of a site. So what study-related tasks will the various team members be doing? Are they appropriately qualified to do them? And that could include things like certification in particular practices. And have they been appropriately trained in the different things they're going to be doing? And at the end of the day, if you're inspected, will you be able to prove it? So we look at some of these in a bit more detail. So it is an investigator responsibility to select appropriately qualified staff. So recruit the people who have the skill sets you need. And that means knowing your protocol, knowing what skill sets you are going to need for the particular study. And particularly if you're developing the protocol yourself, you need to have these things identified up front and incorporated into, if you're applying for a grant or whatever, have thought about these things in advance. And when you're running the trial, it's no good looking for, maybe a very highly qualified study coordinator if you've actually only budgeted for somebody maybe at an entry-level graduate or entry-level research assistant. You need to then identify what kind of training will be needed and provide that training in the protocol and about the investigator, the IMP and any trial-related duties. Also about their responsibilities in relation to safety, the right safety and welfare of any clinical trial subjects. You also need to ensure training in the site SOPs and then any study-related SOPs or policies at the site. And then after all that, you have to delegate appropriately and provide ongoing supervision for the staff members. So even though the investigator has delegated responsibility for different tasks, he or she is still ultimately responsible for how that task is carried out and must be able to show evidence of having provided some level of supervision. So then how would this evidence, how can you prove that you're doing all these things? And I suppose the adage is, if it's not written down, you didn't do it. So really you need to have developed documented processes. So from the very start, that would be anticipating what's going to be involved in having recruitment and training plans in place. Knowing what standard operating procedures are available, and there will be some available at the site, but also if there's study-specific tasks, you may have to develop your own SOPs. Again, if it's a sponsored study, the sponsor will have have defined what these processes are, but if it's an investigator-led study, you'll have to do it yourself. You might have to adapt SOPs then as well, because maybe the existing SOP doesn't fully meet the requirements of your protocol. But if you're doing that, your own institution or site needs to know that you are going to be deviating from normal practice. So then whatever SOPs you do decide that are associated with your trial, you then have to have in place a quality management system to ensure that all members are appropriately trained and that that they're working to the most recent version of the SOP. So that usually involves developing training logs and for SOPs and for all other study-specific training. So the evidence that you'd have for that would be in their curriculum vitae, so that you have evidence that they have the experience they need. It would be in their certificates that they've attended GCP training or maybe something like a venipuncture training. And then that the dates they received that training are documented. For some things there might be repeated training needed. So for example, a time-sensitive certificate like a GCP certificate or CPR cert, you should have a tracking log that will flag, especially for longer studies, when that training needs to be repeated. So you'll have that in a site or study-specific training record. It can be an Excel file, it can be a paper file, but you just need to have a process in place. And then it's a good idea for clinical research staff that everybody retains an individual training record. And that should be ready in the event of any kind of an inspection or audit, that you can just pull it out and it's all there. And we have to obviously pay particular attention to having an up-to-date GCP certification, so that everybody should have attended a full GCP training course and then regular refresher programs. And I'll be talking a bit about that later on. And then once all that is done, the delegation log is the important thing, because any assigned roles or tasks need to be captured within a delegation log. So delegation logs, they fulfill the requirement to maintain a list of appropriately qualified and trained persons, and that's a GCP requirement. And they also address the requirement in GCP and in FDA regulations to maintain a signature sheet. So it's a good idea to have a section on the delegation log where the delegated person signs and then they also provide their initials. And that means you're not doubling up those processes, because sometimes we can have an awful lot of different logs in the site files. They document which study-specific roles and responsibilities are delegated to which team members, but they also demonstrate that the staff know which tasks have been delegated to them. And this is very important. I mean, for example, as nurses working within our scope of practice, we're not supposed to accept delegation for something we're not appropriately trained for. So it's up to us to identify and flag that, look, I do need some training in that area, and once I receive that training, I can perform the task. So you can see that the site delegation log is an essential clinical trial document to record the allocated responsibilities of research team members. And they must list every individual assigned a study-specific role or task. And as Deirdre emphasised, no one should perform a study-related tasks without being delegated, regardless of their status or qualifications. So, for example, if the principal investigator and the sub-investigator are away at a conference and there's a patient visit and the study nurse is looking for somebody to assess the patient, it isn't acceptable that a consultant, even or a registrar from the same healthcare discipline, sees that patient and makes a study-related decision. The only way they should be involved in any way is to remove an immediate hazard. They shouldn't be doing any other trial-related activity, and then that would obviously need to be captured in a record of the deviation. So there needs to be processes in place to make sure that doesn't happen. And that's in relation to, training up backup members of staff and anticipating absences. So it points to the importance of very effective communication between the study coordinator and the study team member, the investigator and the sub-investigator. Another issue then is that the dates delegated and the dates that a person left stopped having a study responsibility needs to be documented. And then finally, that each entry and updated must be signed by the principal investigator. Okay, so we're going to move on to talking a little bit about equipment service records. So this is really all part of your quality management plan at the site. So as an investigator or as a site manager, you need to know what equipment are you going to need for a particular study, where are you going to get it, how are you going to look after it, and how are you going to prove that it works at all times throughout the entire life of the trial. So as I said, the maintenance of service records are part of your quality management system at a site. The service records might be study specific. If you're not working as part of a bigger research site, it could be your team's full responsibility. But what you need to know is, again, when you're assessing the study, what equipment are you going to need, either have yourself or have access to. And you need to maintain an inventory of all that equipment, and that should link to purchase records, service records, calibration certificates, maintenance. So for example, if something should be cleaned after every use, you have to have a plan in place for that. There's no law to say everything has to be serviced every year, but you need to identify when you take on a piece of equipment, how often should it be serviced or calibrated or so on. There should be unique identifiers on each piece of equipment. So that's a printed label on the piece of equipment that links it back to your tracking log. And we're not used to having to do that in a clinical setting, because there could be 10 thermometers, 5 sphygmomanometers and so on. We're not worried about which one we're using today. But when it's used for clinical research, you need to know which ones you're using, and you need to prove that they all have service records. So for example, your 6 thermometers would have 6 individual labels linked to your tracking record. It can't be just one line saying 6 thermometers. You need to have kept your manufacturer's information, your instruction manuals and so on, have identified your maintenance and service plan. And then it does depend who owns the equipment. So you might be using equipment belonging to the site, and in that case, if it's a clinical research centre, most shared equipment will be managed by the research centre. So they'll maintain all those logs and records and so on, and all you really need to know is that it's available if you need it. And so you might have to put some copies of some of them into your site files. You might be using equipment belonging to another department. So for example, a freezer in the laboratory, you need to be able to link the serial number on that freezer to your tracking log, and you need to know that you have access again to their service records and to the temperature records, and that you're going to be able to put copies of the temperature records in your site files. And sometimes the sponsor may provide study-specific equipment, and in that case they'll specify what the care of it should be, and will look after its maintenance to a large extent. But if at the end of the trial they decide that they're not taking that back and they're going to donate it to you for future use, then you need to add that into your equipment lists. And I'm sure you're all doing all of that already. Okay, so this is what your evidence would be. You're keeping your service records and reports. So if you've decided, for example, that an ECG machine needs to be serviced annually, you need to have something, you keep a flow sheet of that, and it can be something like an Excel spreadsheet that just lists everything and that maybe flags when services are due or so on. But if, for example, you serviced your ECG machine in June this year, you can't do it in October next year. It needs to be June or before. It would be a finding if it was out of service, if you have said you're going to service it every year, even if it has been working properly. You also need certificates of calibration for quite a number of equipment items, and they don't always automatically come with something when you buy it. So you could be buying a min-max thermometer, and you have to actually ask when you're buying it, does it have a certificate of calibration? And sometimes it actually costs you more to buy it with the certificate. And then if you can at all, you should, when you're purchasing something, build in a service agreement either with the supplier or with your own tech services department. If you're using hospital tech services department, it's not enough to say it's been serviced. You have to make sure that they can give you a report that would satisfy the requirements in relation to calibration. And that's not always possible. So you need to tie in, and when you're purchasing a piece of equipment as well, you need to kind of think, well, how much is it going to cost me to continue maintaining this for the duration of the trial? And then finally, all of this needs to be captured in standard operating procedures, and as I think Deirdre made clear, these are a major focus of HPRA inspections. So we can't finish really without talking about SOPs in a bit of more detail. So GCP guidelines tell us that systems with procedures that assure the quality of every aspect of a trial should be implemented. And standard operating procedures are the detailed written instructions to achieve uniformity in the performance of a specific function. So standard operating procedures can be site specific, so that they cover, the same task regardless of what trial is being done, or they can be study specific, so something maybe to do with you might have, if you're using some things you might have to, I can't think of it, sterilise after use and things like that. As I said, you might have to develop your own in some cases, and you might have to adapt existing ones. And most of the institutions would have templates available for SOPs. There should be consistency about how they're developed as far as possible. And a lot of the research centres nationally, really, we've shared SOPs or helped each other out with developing them so that as far as possible there are standardised processes in place. And just as Deirdre said, the HPRA can inspect any trials that fall under their remit. And in relation to what I've been covering this morning, the particular thing they will be looking at is your SOPs. So they'll want to see that you have them in place, that they're appropriate to what you're doing, but also that you've processes in place to make sure that staff members are adequately trained in the SOP and that are using the most recent version of the SOP. So that's all to do with your document management systems. They'll inspect the site and they'll go around and look at all your equipment, see where you see your patients, and then they'll link that to your equipment folders and your service records and so on. They'll also look at your staff training records, ask you about what kind of tracking system you have to make sure that all training is up to date. They look at the dates that staff undertook training and compare that with when they actually started doing a particular task. And if somebody untrained in the task is carrying it out, that would be a finding. And they look very closely at your delegation logs, again looking at what date a particular person was signed onto your delegation log, and that they didn't perform any trial-related activity until they had done that, except for, as I said already, to deal with an immediate hazard. And as part of that, they will conduct individual staff interviews and talk to them about their GCP training and their understanding of different aspects of the study. So the good news is that you're not alone in having to do all this. If you're in a situation that you're starting out as an investigator, everybody that's here today are here because they want to increase the quality and the quantity of clinical trials in Ireland and just show that we can do it well. You'll be hearing from Fionnuala Keane later on about the Irish Clinical Trials Research Network, and that will continue to develop processes and procedures that can be shared nationally. There's a lot of support available from the existing clinical research facilities and clinical research centres. The Irish Clinical Research Network provides support in developing the skills and education, orientation and so on for research nurses nationally. And we have, for example, an orientation pack available. So if a new nurse or research assistant or other member of the research team is employed, that can help orientate them to their role. And that's available on our website or from any members of the Research Nurses Network here today. GCP training is now delivered regionally, and there are a number of the GCP trainers here today, and the details of those are usually on the Molecular Medicine Ireland website, so you can look at what's available, what's coming up, and they'll provide a full GCP training and a refresher training. And then there are a number of clinical research training programs available. In RCSI we developed a postgraduate program for clinical research nurses, but that has grown really, and we have scientists and pharmacists and so on completing our modules. And UCG and UCD both provide MSc in clinical research. So thank you for listening, and I hope you found that useful.
That was a really excellent presentation, and I'm sure we'll have some questions. We certainly have time. Maybe just to kick off some questioning, you'd mentioned about the requirements for GCP training, and mentioned separately initial training and then updating of training. Could you talk a bit more about what's required for each, in particular what's required to be certified initially versus to be kept up to date?
Yeah. Well, we're all required to have GCP training, and that's incorporated into SI 190 and the European Directive and so on. There's nothing to say you have to do it every 6 months, every year, every 5 years. There's nothing cast in stone. But the general rule of thumb is that everybody should have GCP training when they start in a research environment. And we would generally say that it should be refreshed or updated every 2 years, and that's really so that you're ensuring that you're still interpreting everything appropriately, but also that you're getting updates in legislation or in different frameworks. There's a lot of changes coming down the line. Now, for sites, the main focus of GCP training is on investigator responsibilities, but then you can also get training in sponsor responsibilities and different aspects of it. But I think it's essential now, when somebody's only new in the door in a research setting, really, they can do GCP training and they've ticked that box, but I don't really think anybody fully integrates it till they're into the system, and it's always a good idea maybe to, redo your training. I wouldn't be waiting 2 years the first time, because it makes much more sense to you when you've been in the job for a while.
Right. Very good. Thank you. Any questions from the audience?
Hi. Sorry, Deirdre, just a quick question. If you're taking, say, a BP from a participant, should you be recording the unique identifier of that particular piece of equipment so that you can trace it back if there's an issue, or?
It really just, not necessarily, it really just depends where you're located. If your study is located in one particular area all the time, you just need records of the equipment from that area.
Sometimes your equipment might be transient, you might have a couple of pieces of the same equipment, but wouldn't be using the exact one.
Well, just to have records, my understanding is to have records to make sure that all of the pieces of equipment you're potentially going to use would be covered, that you have records for those. But no, you wouldn't be every single time you take a blood pressure.
Yeah.
But you will tend to see your patients in the same general locations all the time. And if you were very mobile, that you were seeing lots of patients in different places, say going out to patients' homes and so on, I would recommend that you'd have a study-specific piece of equipment that you bring with you, that you're not going to be using, just ad hoc pieces of equipment. Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Thank you for a fascinating presentation. How much of this is transferable to the clinical trials that are non-medicinal, that may not fall within HPRA or EU Clinical Trials Directive, do you think?
Well, that's a really good question, actually, because we haven't got much regulations. for the non-interventional studies. Within the research centres, and I suppose and institutions, our recommendations would be that you apply a similar standard to any research you do. So we would very much expect you to always still be working to SOPs, to have systems in place and so on. And I think that will be tightened up a lot when the Health Information Bill is published, hopefully. I mean, we don't know yet about what level of governance there will be of non-interventional clinical research. We know that the ethics committees will that the HICWA will have a supervisory role with the ethics committees. It looks like the ethics committees have the authority to inspect clinical trials that they've approved, but they certainly aren't resourced to do it. So I think I think institutional governance will become a much bigger issue. And already I think a lot of the academic institutions and like the College of Surgeons and CRF in Cork and so on are putting in place officers who look after that end of things, that ensure that compliance with regulations. The Declaration of Helsinki, for example, applies to all human subject research, irrespective of whether it comes under the legislation or not. And SI 190 and so on say we have to comply with the Declaration of Helsinki.
I think there's a huge amount of learning from the people who are involved in these studies for the non-medicinal, non-EU, non-regulated
Oh, absolutely,
trials.
yeah. I think you have to apply a comparable standard. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Deirdre, for an excellent presentation. Before I introduce the next speaker, Declan's asked me to say that all of the presentations slides will be made available on the website, which is noted on the front of your brochures, the TMRN website, which I'm sure will be welcomed by you all.